Good morning, everyone. Hope everybody's doing well, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Thank you for attending CIVIQ. This will be our online format. If you're familiar with our program that we're so proud of here, we have been running a quarterly speaker series now for almost 3 years. And we've transitioned, as many people have, to an online format, and we've transitioned that program over the years. This is our quarterly speaker series called CIVIQ that honors Robert Taylor. I want to thank you for the sponsors of this program, the Lyndhurst Foundation and the Riverview Foundation. Without their generous sponsorship, we wouldn't be able to provide the quality program that we have and the quality speakers that we offer during this program and the educational program that we bring to you. Before we get started this morning, I want to give you a few updates on the studio work. It's one of the most often questioned, delivered questions that I get in our community. What's the studio up to? And so here's a little bit of that. We're working on a pilot project in partnership with the YMCA of Metropolitan Chattanooga, the Enterprise Center, Patent Towers. Excuse me, I think that our slides are delayed a little bit. Hopefully you're seeing the Patent Towers Common Grounds slide. And this partnership is in large part to pilot public realm improvements at one of our most dense residential populations in our downtown. And so a reminder that we talked about this earlier in the year, one of our first quarterly civics. And just the geographical location is the corner of 11th and Market Street. We'll be piloting improvements such as seating and ground cover and ground installation, ground artwork, lighting, and we have an artist team working with us, and we've begun that work. This is an aerial view at the corner of 11th and Broad Street, adjacent to our public library. The street mural continues this week, and we're continuing that process with a local artist team. This is a corner of Market and 11th Street in progress. And we're really proud of our artist team that we have working with us currently. Andrew Travis has been doing quite a bit of the work on site. He's been on site today and yesterday, and Thelma Holland and Charity Cullum. And then we're working with another artist named Tucson. And also want to let you know that we have launched a very large neighborhood planning process in the West Side community. That's our urban renewal community west of US 27. And we launched that process in September 1. It will be about a 9-month planning process, and we're in the data gathering phase right now. And we have a team of residents that live in the community that are doing door-to-door surveys in the community to gather input from their neighbors about what their current challenges are and what the opportunities for the future are in the neighborhood. That process will be about 3 months long, and we hope to have a community event in the beginning of December. So stay in touch with us there. We're delivering most of our information on our website, westsideevolves.com. So again, I want to say thank you for being here today. We feel really honored to have 3 extremely highly regarded individuals in the field of transportation and urban design with us. And we're going to have an excellent program. I'm going to do a quick round of introductions, very quick. And then I'm going to give a rundown of the event and turn it over to Jerome. First of all, we have Jerome Horne, who is the Ridership Experience Specialist with IndyGo, the Indianapolis Public Transportation Corporation. And he will be moderating our panel today. He'll be doing a little bit of an overview, high-level overview of the topic matter, and then doing some moderating. Second of all, we have Jarrett Walker of Jarrett Walker Associates with us. And notably, he was our first civic program speaker in 2017 and kicked off the Jarrett Walker teamwork in Chattanooga on the car to transit system redesign process, which we'll share a little bit about today. And we're thankful to have him here. Thanks, Jarrett. And Victor Dover, of course, he has been another Civic speaking alum from 2019. And Victor's a partner Victor's partner, Joe Kohl, and he had been working in Chattanooga for quite some time now, notably working in the Russville, Fort Negley, Jefferson Heights neighborhood plan from circa 1998. And recently on the Ben and the Alstom site neighborhood plan from 2019. We're very honored to have Victor here today. So a little bit of housekeeping as we get started our program. If you have questions during our speakers' presentations, please submit those through the chat function, and Jerome will pick them up following the presentations, and we'll certainly get to those during the Q&A session after the speaker's presentation. So again, thank you for joining us. It's great to have you here. And Jerome, it's yours.
All right, thank you so much, Eric. Let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, and we're seeing the full screen. Excellent. All right, well, thanks again. Happy to be here. Once again, I'm Jerome Horne from IndyGo in Indianapolis, and I'm going to just go really quickly, high level, kind of explaining our transit transformation in Indy and how that is going to be contextually relevant to Chattanooga, and I'll allow Victor and Jarrett to go into more detail. So first things first, let's get some of the rumors out of the way. Indiana, this is not all of Indiana. A lot of people think Indiana is just in the middle of cornfields. For those of you familiar with the popular TV show Parks and Recreation, you may be familiar with the fictional city of Pawnee, which is based off of a real place called Muncie, Indiana, where Ball State University is. There is a spot that is not corn, and that is Indianapolis. Indianapolis, the capital city of Indiana. And what we're looking down upon is Monument Circle, which is one of our great civic spaces in the city and really close to being the geographical center of the city and the state of Indiana. So a little bit more context about the city of Indianapolis. So we are quite large from a geographical standpoint. We are 400 square miles. We have a population of just under 1 million people. And as you can see here, what this slide is depicting is the outline of Indianapolis, and it's overlaid over some other cities in the US. And really what I'm talking about here is density versus geographical size. I always like to compare our neighbor to the north, the city of Chicago, which is about half the geographical size of Indianapolis, but has 3 million, almost 3 million people living in half the space. And so, you know, Indianapolis is not very dense, and that presents some challenges when it comes to providing public services like transit or building roadways or EMS, fire police services that are really important to consider when we're talking about transit and providing those amenities. So in Indianapolis, one of the things that we knew that we needed to pay more attention to was transit. Transit has really been more of an afterthought. We are a very auto-centric city, and a city that really grew up in the time of the automobile. And as such, the existing transit system is not as useful as it could be to many people. One of those first things was focusing on downtown. So most of the bus routes come into downtown, and what you're seeing on this slide on the right is what we used to call our downtown loop. And this is where all the bus routes would come, and some of the buses would make the complete loop, others would not. Some of the buses only went through just part of the loop. And it was very confusing if you were someone that needed to transfer or catch a bus to understand, one, where do I catch my bus? There were about 12 different places where you could board a bus, and whether or not that bus had just entered the loop or was leaving the loop. And we had these outside shelters, which didn't provide much comfort in inclement weather, and there was no place to use the restroom. So you were out of luck if you needed to. And it was just not a very user-friendly or conducive place. And so enter the Julia M. Carson Transit Center. This facility opened on June 26, 2016. And I remember being there on that Sunday morning when the first bus came in and went to the wrong bay. But beyond that, we moved on, and we really wanted to give our riders a sense of dignity. We feel that it is very important for our riders on transit to feel like the facility is, you know, world class. And so what you're seeing here are some beautiful shots of the exterior with some good plantings and rain gardens, the bus bays with real-time arrival signs, and it's well lit at nighttime. And this is really an inviting place that people want to be. This shows you another shot in context of downtown. The architecture is really kind of iconic, and this is, intentional. Whether you're visiting Indianapolis or just passing through, you look at this facility and you go, well, what is that? And so once again, it really is important that it's both functional, because it needs to be functional, not just pretty, but also, looks good. This is a high level looking down satellite view of the facility. There are 19 bus bays that are covered. And we have, you can see in the upper left there, some of those rain gardens and seating areas and just kind of the layout of the facility. This is actually half of a city block, and I'll show a different photo so you can see that in better context. But up towards the top of the photo, there's some bump outs with crosswalks to make crossing the streets easier. And once again, like I said, we really were focusing on a beautiful but yet functional design. The interior, so lots of natural lighting here. There's lots of glass. We are a LEED Gold certified facility, so we have a geothermal heating and cooling system, which really helps us save on energy costs. And it's just a pleasant environment to wait inside. And as you can see, just lots of natural light coming in that makes a big difference. So I think it's really important to talk about siting and location of this particular facility. So this red outline here is the transit center. And as you can see, it occupies a half of a typical city block in downtown Indianapolis. Just to the north is our city hall and the beautiful Luga Plaza that is right across the street. And City Hall is an important destination that a lot of people are going to. Just north of that is our city market, which is an event space and food hall. In this blue outline, just to the northwest, we're looking at a new neighborhood called Market East. And this consists of some new office towers, more green space, apartments, and this neighborhood is growing beyond this outline here. And then just south of the transit center of this blue arrow is our basketball arena where the Indiana Pacers play. And then Monument Circle again in this orange circle here, once again, the geographic center of the city. And there are several other things that are within close proximity, just a few blocks walk from the transit center. Now, there's still room for improvement. Now, I will say almost all of this blue lot and where the transit center is located just a few years ago were all parking lots. And there's still some large amount of surface parking here, but there's a lot of opportunity for transit-oriented development and really taking advantage of this facility and proximity to transit. And then a little bit on the human level as we zoom in. So the transit center is located over here on your right, and then we're looking across to our city hall and the plaza. And I just want to demonstrate once again, a lot of the streets in downtown Indianapolis are very wide, about 6 lanes wide. And that is not very inviting to transit riders. Every transit rider begins and ends their journey as a pedestrian. And so it's very important we think about that. So once again, we built some bump outs here to really shorten that distance that people have to cross the street. And this is really important for those that maybe have mobility challenges or those that are elderly. You see our cultural trail here, which is a great 8-mile urban, fully protected and separated bike and pedestrian trail that goes around downtown, and then a bike share station right across the street here. There are even some scooters on the transit center property. So we're really trying our best to make this as multimodal and as useful to as many people as possible. So a little bit more about the Indianapolis transit story. So this chart is from 2016, and what this is showing is in transit investment per capita, or revenue service hours, or the amount of hours that we're running buses on the street. In 2016, despite Indianapolis being the 14th or 15th largest city by population in the country, we ranked 86th in the amount of transit service that we're putting on the road. So Chattanooga was actually above us at 83 in terms of the amount of service that was running. And so what does this translate into? It translates into waiting too long for a bus. I share this jokingly, but this has really meaningful impacts for riders and folks that they're depending on transit. So if you've tuned in today, wherever you're sitting right now, just imagine that you can't leave until the top of the hour and you only have a 1-minute window. And once that 1-minute window has passed, if you haven't left, you're stuck and you have to wait for another hour. And that's exactly what it's like to wait for a bus that only comes once an hour. And so one of my favorite slides, hot mess and sexy lines. Comparing here on the left is the existing transit system in Indianapolis to what the bus network redesign that we hope to transition to. And the most important thing to notice here is that these lines are color coded. Green lines means a route is only running once an hour, blue every 30 minutes, red every 15 minutes or better. Those red lines are very important to focus on. That is what we consider every 15 minutes or better frequent transit. And frequent transit, that is really the kind of the moment where people stop relying so much on the schedule and know if they go outside, a bus is going to be coming along relatively soon. So as you can see on the right in our system redesign, you begin to see that the system takes a different shape. You see a frequent grid appear. You see more crosstown routes so that people, depending on where you're traveling, you're not forced to come into downtown and transfer. You can simply take a route, or if you need to make a transfer, because we're running more frequently and more often, then making that transfer is easy. And I know Jarrett will go into more detail about that. So once again, hub and spoke system, very infrequent, moving to frequent grid with more transfers and more frequent service. Finally, you see these thicker lines, which represent bus rapid transit, which I'll get into in just a bit. So what does this frequent transit and bus system redesign translate into? The biggest thing is access to opportunity, access to where people can go. And so what this chart is showing that the percentage of the population that can access frequent transit is 10% today. We're going up to 35% that are going to be close to those 15-minute lines. Nearly half the jobs in the region are going to be close to frequent transit. And very importantly, low-income households and minority households go up to nearly half that are going to have access to this frequent transit, which is really important to accessing jobs and opportunity. So I mentioned bus rapid transit, BRT. We just opened the Red Line, which is our central north-south spine in the city. We just opened last September. This is a 13-mile route with 28 stations. And we run in 60% dedicated lanes. And as you can see in that upper right, there's dedicated lanes down one of our most important streets in the city. But that dedicated infrastructure is really important to allowing the bus to not get stuck in traffic. We have beautiful stations that have level boarding where people can just board, roll right on. You can roll your bike onto the bus. Because people pay before they get on these vehicles, very similar to a train, they can board through any door, and that really speeds up the overall boarding process and travel time. And plus the stations are spaced about every half mile or so. Finally, making fares fair. One of the biggest barriers to transit is fare, but right now in our system, you have to pay either with exact cash or go to select locations where you can purchase fare. So we're rolling out a new fare payment system that will use both an electronic app or a hard reloadable tap card. And the other big thing is we're introducing something called fare capping. And fare capping we see as a more equitable way for transit, where the amount you pay to ride transit is limited daily or weekly. So if you pay more than $4 a day, once you hit that $4, you ride the rest of transit that day for free. Or during the week, if you hit a certain amount, once you hit that amount, the rest of your transit rides for the week are free. And then finally, we as a transit agency are beginning to think outside the proverbial box. We want to be a mobility integrator. So we're not just in the business of thinking about running 40-foot buses or trains. We want to work with other modes around the city, whether that be bike share, car share, scooters, and think about ways that we can partner with them and even make it easier to pay and plan for trips across those multiple modes. And this provides, we talk about first mile, last mile connectivity. This really unlocks that for a lot of people because we know buses and will not be able to go everywhere. And this really makes a difference to providing that access. So that's my high level overview. I'm going to stop sharing and now turn it over to Jarrett.
Thank you very much, Jerome. And thanks so much to Eric Myers and the design studio for putting this together for us. I'm going to talk about the transit in transit-oriented development for a second, because transit-oriented development is a conversation that happens a great deal among architects, among developers. And it's important to understand that transit has its own contribution and has its own needs, and that it's important to work with those as we're imagining the city. So Most people who haven't thought very much about transit are forming opinions about it by seeing it from the outside. And this is what transit looks like from the outside to many people. They make a judgment about transit based on their emotional reaction to the vehicle. The vehicle, however, it's the wrapper. It's not the content. It's just the wrapper. And you have to see beyond that to understand what transit's actually doing and how it's actually affecting your city. So to me, transit is in the freedom business. Here's a person. This example happens to be from Miami. Think about her situation, if she chooses to rely on transit or needs to rely on transit. She's asking, where could I be soon? And the answer to that question, and if you think about that question for a moment, that question is the same as asking, where could I work? Where could I play? Where could I study? Where could I shop? Where could I worship? Who can I visit? Who could I meet? Maybe even who will she marry? All of these things require the ability to go places so that you can do things. And for that reason, I would say that those questions add up to the question, how free am I? Am I free? If freedom, it means the presence, the abundance of meaningful options in my life. Well, we can measure that. I'm sorry, I'm missing a slide here, I apologize. So the outcome of that is some sort of blob around her, an area around her, which I would call the wall around her life, the area beyond which she cannot go. And so that area is, and to make her freer, we want to make that area bigger or put more stuff in that area. So that's what transportation planning does as opposed to development planning. Transportation planning makes the area bigger, development planning puts more stuff into it. So what does that mean in the context of your network? We've been working on your network for a while now, and here's what we've come up with. The primary problems of your network are the service is extremely infrequent. Fortunately, Jerome has already introduced the color scheme, which is the same on those maps we did for Indianapolis. It's the same in all of our studies. It's on the left. The dark reddish brown is service every 10 minutes or less, service that's really coming soon. Red is 15. The pinkish color is 20. Blue is 30, green is 60. And what we're trying to do here is increase frequency across a larger area so that more people have access to service that's always coming soon. Now, the challenge about this is that right now you have two different transit systems running side by side downtown. You have the shuttle, which has one look and feel running on Broad Street. And then you have a bus that has a different look and feel, a set of buses running down Market Street. And your transit agency is actually expected to pay out of its budget for two transit systems running side by side. When in fact, of course, two transit systems running side by side are consuming resources that could be used to actually expand people's access to opportunity. And to do that, the first thing you do is to not compete with yourself. So in the draft plan, we've replaced the shuttle with a frequent service, a single frequent service. And as a result, we're able to make it more frequent and more extensive. It runs every 10 minutes. And as you'll see, we've taken some key elements of the network and are running them as branches or extensions of the shuttle, which means that as the shuttle goes south out of downtown, half the buses turn left on Main and go on out ultimately down to Rossville, and half of the buses turn right and end up going down to the incline and to the Alton Park neighborhood beyond the incline. That enables us to create, with the same resource, both bus services into the city and a frequent bus service within the city. That's really the core idea. But as you'll see, there are still some infrequent routes in this network. CARTA does not have nearly the quantity of service that it needs, and we'll still have some of these low frequencies until CARTA is able to afford a more robust network. So here's the existing network downtown, and then here's the proposed network. And as you'll see here, you have the two separate transit systems running side by side on Broad and Chestnut. And here you have, on Broad and Market, sorry, and here you have the shuttle making one single path, continuing outside the city on both ends. If you want, you can say that the shuttle has been extended to the incline, because half the shuttles do go to the incline under this plan. And you have other routes converging very directly on downtown. Now, this circle T that you see here is not a proposal for a particular place. It's the current North End Transit Facility, but a process is going on to identify the permanent site for that facility. Short-term payoffs, exactly what we talked about before. The blobs around people's lives get bigger. So the dark bluish gray here is the area that people can, this is from the particular point of view, Market and Fraser, just on the north side of the river. The area people can get to now and can still get to is in grayish blue, but the light blue is areas that they can't get to now and can get to under the new plan. And we can quantify that. 45% more people can get to a job at Market and Fraser. People living around Market and Fraser can get to 18% more jobs in a reasonable amount of time. So we are expanding people's freedom. And every time you make a decision about transit infrastructure or transit service, you are deciding who will be free and how free they will be. And it's important to keep that frame in mind when someone comes along and says, well, this isn't convenient for me, this bus stop shouldn't be here, that bus route needs to go over there. You can measure the freedom impact of each of those choices. So what does this mean downtown? The new shuttle eliminating the duplication between shuttles and regular buses, freeing up a lot of resources. Now, these are planned to be electric buses, but they will be going on beyond the choo-choo, going on beyond North Chattanooga. And that means, of course, that there'll be a greater diversity of people on them, which we think is wonderful. Time transfer pulse needed downtown. So when we are running low frequency services, when we can't offer that, that assurance that the bus is coming soon, then there's the problem of what happens if you ride in on one low frequency bus and need to connect to another low frequency bus. You could wait 45 minutes for your first bus and then have to wait 45 minutes for the connection. And that makes the travel time impossible. It means your freedom, as we showed you with those blobs, is reduced. So the typical way to approach this is called a pulse, which is that every hour or half hour, those infrequent buses are scheduled to all be at the same place at the same time, so that you can get off of any bus and onto another. This is the Downtown Transit Center in Eugene, Oregon. You've already seen the one in Indianapolis. However, they can also be on street if they are very carefully designed. They can be built into the curbs on certain streets, so long as it is very easy for people to walk from any bus to any other. So in sum up, sort of why accommodate transit? I've been working in this field for 25 years, and I've spent many, many hours in meetings with downtown interests trying to figure out whether or how to accommodate transit. And very, very often, the conversation goes quickly to the vehicle. Those buses, they're too big, they're too noisy, they don't fit our ambiance. We need the transit center out of the way. And very frequently, they do get built out of the way. Indianapolis won this battle. The transit center is across from City Hall. But in Las Vegas, for example, the transit center is almost a half mile out of downtown, next to the courthouse, surrounded by bail bonds offices. And so think about what that says, to put the transit center next to the jail. Think about the way that expresses a set of attitudes about who rides transit, but also creates that reality by creating an infrastructure that is sending a negative signal, an unwelcoming signal to people who don't associate themselves with jails. Yes, you'll have to change buses at the jail. Not something you want people to think. And so the transit center can't be out of the way. And this is the real struggle, because the starting point is usually, oh, we need a transit center. Well, where is a surplus piece of land that nobody wants? And that's how you end up with a transit center that is so far out of downtown that it can't really function. And again, we can measure the freedom impact of those kinds of decisions. Secondly, the convergence of transit on a point means that that point has more access. Therefore, there should be something there to use it. And this is where the development side comes in. when we're creating the transit pulse point is a hotspot where more people can get to it. And it therefore should be a place where there's a lot of stuff to get to. That also has a measurable benefit to people's freedom. Because ultimately the question before you is, are you going to plan around emotional reactions to the experience of transit today? Or are you going to lead by visualizing, liberating, and welcoming transit and creating? If you design your city around attitudes toward transit today, you will create design that reinforces those attitudes. To some extent, design based on a prejudice will make that prejudice true. On the other hand, if you take the view that you want transit to be liberating and welcoming, you'll make more courageous choices that may not always pay off in the extreme short run, but that will pay off in the long run by gradually helping you evolve a system that both is liberating and feels liberating and welcoming. So those are my comments. And with that, I will pass it back to Victor.
Well, thanks, Jarrett. I have to tell you, I love following you, but I'd love listening to you even more. And my fandom grows for Jarrett Walker every time I get the chance, like we just had, to learn more from him. Mm-hmm. He spoke about the transit component of transit-oriented development. So I thought I would speak a little bit about the development, about the place that the transit operates in and what we find when transit is really physically at the center of community life. He also spoke about one of my favorite subjects, which is that the city is really a big communications device that is sending us messages all the time about what's important to us as a society and as households and as businesses and as institutions. And if the signals are off and we're sending the wrong message, we need to change that. And one of those important signals is this message about transportation and freedom. I want you to think for just a minute about what it's like to take a trip to London. You step out of a hotel room, let's say, or out of your office or what have you, and into the street. And if you're a visitor, like one of us Yanks visiting from across the pond, you see the double-decker buses, and you see their iconic silhouettes evolving a bit over the years. There's some modern ones, and you see that bright red color that you associate with it, and you get a message instantly. And chances are, against the beautiful marbles of Fleet Street buildings and the kind of spectacular city street scenes that London has so many of, you see that bus and you pull your phone out and you hold up the camera lens and you quickly take a picture of it. You say, look how cool. So they are also sending a message, and through some careful branding and some tradition and some adaptive iconography over decades and decades, they actually turned the lowly bus into a thing that's sending a message that's very positive, and also doesn't seem at all out of place in its scenery. You know, the backdrop for those bright red objects moving along the street is our normal city streets in a prideful city. Now I'll show you a very different one that's also incredibly positive in my mind. This is a scene from Manila. So here in the Philippines, a much less wealthy country, I took this photograph at the bus depot in Makati, which is a bustling part of Manila, or Greater Manila. And you know, the buses are lined up, and there was this fellow grilling corn. He had a little portable grill on wheels, and he was making food, and this was a great business for him, and he had a lot of customers because he was at the center where all that bustle was taking place. People were coming and going, and they would stop and they'd buy some corn from him. And I watched him for quite a while, and every few minutes, maybe every 3 or 4 minutes, you'd hear a gentle little toot of a bus horn. He'd look up, he'd grab the handles on his mobile grill and wheel it out of the way 3 or 4 or 5 feet, and a bus would pull out of its bay and into the streets and move on its way. And then he would roll it back into place and start selling again. And I thought, what a beautiful example of very small and very informal and very doable and livable community life in operation. His business works, his livelihood here comes from the fact that there are people around, and that transit's a happy thing. Look at the smile on the lady's face in the upper center of the screen. It's a very positive thing. These people are experiencing that freedom of being able to move around. Now, the idea that transit is part of the scene and just naturally grows in among commerce and institutional life and civic life is not foreign to Chattanooga. It's far from it. And this old picture of Market Street kind of tells the story. And you've proudly protected the old buildings that the old streetcars would go in, or you've kept the rails under the tracks or in the city museum because there's like a story there and you don't want to lose it. And so Americans once had outstanding transit systems in places like Montgomery, Alabama, which had the lightning route that was rivaling Richmond's for the first electrified system. They were normal things, even in the Sun Belt, even in our southern cities. Now, just to go back to London for a second for comparison, look at the center of this picture of Piccadilly Circus. The center of this picture is that bright red bus. And of course, from here, you could go down into the Tube and go many places from the Piccadilly station, and you could walk up Regent Street as a pedestrian. There are lots of places you could go when you catch a rideshare vehicle or a taxi. But the fact is, the transit isn't kept away from this. And the transit is kept in the middle of it. And I think it's actually part of the scenery and the story and the excitement of it, even the branding of it. There's one place you can see this on display. It was once pointed out to me by Philip Johnson many years ago, and that's at Main Street in Disneyland. In Disneyland and in Disney World, Walt Disney didn't keep vehicles out of Main Street, USA, that embalmed replica of a Main Street that people flock to so they can take a picture with the backdrop. In fact, they have trolleys and horse-drawn vehicles and fire trucks and the monorail and all these things going back and forth to actually give it more of the reality of a real city street scene instead of just at that place. If our London visitor got really inspired, like many an artist, they would actually they would make their painting depicting the bus. They would show that rainy little island with its reflections in the street, because it's always wet. They would show that red reflecting in the light. A film or a TV show that shows London always finds a wet street and lets you see that red light reflecting the thing. So it is not a thing that they try to hide or push away. It's actually a thing they celebrate. And now that's not unique to Europeans, or that's something we've done all over this country. St. Charles Avenue in New Orleans has that famous streetcar, and a more practical and modern version. The buses in Asian cities aren't kept away from the center where the department stores and the advertisements and the offices are located. They're brought right into the center. And I was really happy to see Jerome talk about how Indianapolis embraced this idea that you play it up, you don't push it to the side. Thank you for showing that, Jerome. You can stand on the Tillamook Crossing in Portland for a few seconds, and you'll get a chance to take a picture like this one, where you see buses or light rail, or people on bikes and people on foot, all sharing this bridge. And they photograph it and put it in their Chamber of Commerce brochures. They photograph it and they put it in their Convention and Visitors Bureau advertisements. Come here because the transit is so cool. Your visitors from out of town will go home amazed, not out of sight and out of mind. I thought it's clever in Barcelona how the trams here on a side street or on the Avinguda Diagonal, the most important big street, have grass in between the rails, because they actually took the installation of transit as an opportunity to make the city a little greener, not just metaphorically, but literally. Now, we tend to operate transit at a disadvantage and then wonder whether or not we can politically stand the idea of giving transit its own space, its own lane. This is in Trondheim. This is the before picture. the bus here struggling with the same traffic that the motorists are struggling in at peak hour. And they took the bold step, a simple but bold step of saying, we're going to give the transit vehicle its own lane. And then if you make the choice to take the bus instead of driving your own car or riding alone, you're going to get a quicker trip and a more pleasant trip than the one where you're stressed out you're behind the wheel of your own car. So they actually took it on to make the transit have a distinct advantage over driving alone. This image is not from a foreign land. This is Los Angeles. This is Los Angeles Metro animated GIF, and it shows their bus in its own express lane. Now, what message are they sending when they let, in the course of the 15 seconds that this GIF takes to go by, they let 200 and something people go by in transit for a really small comparable number of people going by in the single occupant vehicle lane at the same time. So you send messages with the way you operate and install the transit, but you also send messages with the way you build the context around them. I've shown this picture to the CIVIQ audience before, not long ago in the 90s, and hence the fuzzy old school digital photograph. The area just beyond the metro station in South Miami looked like this. It was just a bunch of drab asphalt and not really a place where people wanted to be. So they altered it and they planted trees. How basic is that? And they widened the sidewalks and they allowed outdoor dining. And even before any new architecture came in or any new businesses replaced old ones, they just simply made it the center of community life on purpose. So you step off the transit vehicle now, you step into a place that feels like you're supposed to be there. And this idea that you meld transit improvement with the creation of special public space is on display in many successful cities. Here's Bellevue. A transit plaza is actually a good place to get a cup of coffee or to meet a friend for lunch. Here's Providence. They had more space to work with. And this was their ceremonial centerpiece space, much like your Broad Street in front of the aquarium. And they took that space and they said, we're going to bring the buses together here in a place where you can make easy transfers at the heart of the community. And then we will set that up so that you're comfortable when you're waiting with the trees and shelters. The other amenities that Jerome spoke about, we won't push them off next to the bail bondsman. And it's a simple enough space, isn't it? I mean, they just decided this was geography that was not just for motorists. And what they did, well, they created a place where when it's time for a special event, the community owns that space. Here's another angle on it. I think these are interesting cases where the way you make the place greener, the way you make public space, the way you design streets, and the way you install transit and build buildings can all be in one parts of one thing. Street redesign, a very important topic, of course, and I spoke a lot about that to the CIVIQ audience last time. But I'm going to re-show this one example because it was a big wide street which had been made one way. This is the old main street of downtown West Palm Beach. This street has been dramatically transformed to a minimum width, curbless design, plaza-like feeling to it, and transit is returned to the center of the scene. Now it's their cute circulator, of course, but it wasn't a foreign idea, I guess, to upgrade the experience for pedestrians and for those who might be going, say, to a restaurant on the street, for the very reason that Jerome mentioned, when these transit vehicles are just platforms for moving pedestrians around, and then we return to being pedestrians when we reach that space. Which makes me want to challenge you on the unfinished project of the great streets downtown in Chattanooga. I know them well. This is one of my least favorite parts of Broad Street, and yet it has the icon of the silhouette, the crystalline silhouette of the aquarium at the end. It has, plenty of activity going on in the surrounding blocks, but somehow the street itself feels like a canvas not yet filled in. And just to make a dramatic and perhaps unfair comparison, what about if you visit the comparable ceremonial central space in Barcelona? What are you going to find? This is the Rambles, a famous promenade street in the heart of Barcelona, the place where people want to be. When you step back and you think about the difference between this space and Broad Street, it's not that different in size. At the point where I shot that photograph, the cross section from building face to building face on the Ramble, Los Rambles, in Barcelona is a little over 120 feet wide, 126. But look at the proportion of the space that's devoted to vehicles versus the amount of space that's devoted to walking or vending or dining or planting trees. Then, just for comparison, a very flattering and exaggeratedly beautiful simplified cross-section my colleague Rob Pitkowski produced for Broad Street, which shows that on the typical section of Broad, you've got even more space than they have on the Ramble, on the Les Rambles. So I teased Rob a little bit about this because he made those trees all look a lot more grown and good and not as wispy and vulnerable as they actually are in the present conditions. It's much more fair to take a look at that street scene via Google Street View. And it has improved, I have to say. It's better because the aquarium is there. It's better because Carter's Shuttle North, or the Carter North Garage, was enhanced with the climbing gym that gave it this architectural crystalline. But it doesn't yet feel like one of those great places that was designed for people. It still feels like if you came down in a spaceship from outer space and you landed here, you would assume this planet is dominated by cars rather than people. You know, over on the bend, on the riverfront, not far away, part of the concept there is to create what downtown is also aspiring to be, which is a car optional or car light community, where there will be a lot of things clustered close together, and there will be good streets and some lavish detail on mobility for those on two wheels, for example. But one of the big ideas in the bend is this Central Park, which you'll be glad to know, since you're from Portland, Jerome, Jarrett, is sized similarly to the park blocks in the heart of Portland, and Olmsted's masterpiece plan there. But here at the upper left-hand corner where you see the steeple, that's the intersection at Riverfront Parkway and the Park Street in the Bend. And what that will be, I would hope, is a mobility hub of the kind that Jerome described, where you can easily switch between your transit trip and moving around on a bike, or moving around on a scooter, or walking, or getting a low-speed electric circulator, or catching an Uber or Lyft, or go on down the list. What I'm trying to describe is that really the transit is part of a larger transportation ecosystem that includes your bikes and scooters and whatever is next. And sometimes those are high-tech, new technologically enabled things, and sometimes they're low-tech, like using your own 2 feet. But in the end, you don't want just one of these to work. You don't want just transit and bikes to work and not have motor vehicles work. You actually want them all to work and feel like part of a menu. So it's a both and rather than either or approach. I also think it's important to remember, for those motorists on the call who by now are indignant about how all three of us have made it sound like transit is so important. Okay, drivists, I want, as opposed to cyclists, I want you to remember that every time somebody is getting on one of Jarrett's buses or on Jerome's BRT or on a train or what have you, they basically should have a halo over their heads, because they kept their car keys in their pocket if they have a car, and they are not in a lane blocking your way when you're trying to get somewhere at peak hour. So they are your new best friends. So instead of trying to treat them badly by pushing them and their vehicles, their transit vehicles, off to the edge of things and out of downtown, you should be trying to embrace them warmly and say thank you for staying out of our cramped roads that are busy at peak hour. The transportation and mobility ecosystem in a mature city looks kind of like this. You exit the Paris metro, or you get off a Paris bus on the Boulevard Rochechouart, and you can see people making deliveries, you can see people driving cars, you can see people on the bus, gets its own lane. You see people using the bike facility. It looks like you actually intend people to enjoy using it. And just a few dozen feet from where I shot that photograph, I shot this one of the fellow on the bike, because as you move away from the station area, the bike infrastructure just gets better and better, and the scene gets greener and greener. And that ought to be a goal for everybody. So over in the Bend, we include streets that have first-class bike accommodation, like the cycle track on the extension of Main Street. In this hypothetical picture, you're looking from the heart of the old Alston plant toward the river. Imagine being able to take your bike from the south side to the Tennessee River and have an experience like this. Stop at the mobility hub, or stop somewhere along the Blue Goose Hollow Trail, or ride to downtown and take transit anywhere you want to go in the region. That's what we should be shooting for. Now, transit at the center of life has a competitor, a natural predator, an enemy, basically, which is excessive parking at the center of community life. And I have this bad habit of going to places and painting pink on my photographs of them to show you how much of it is devoted to parking. You get up in a helicopter or the drone, or look out your hotel room window, and you see just how much of the city has been picked apart and eaten for parking. And so these two things are working against each other. You can't build the city that really feels like a city as the prosperous heart of your region, and optimize for transit and walking and biking at the center of community life, and still just embed so much parking that it overwhelms everything else and just promotes more car trips. You are actually doing quite well compared to some other cities. Here's 3 Rust Belt cities, 2 of them in Sun Belt locations, Buffalo, Birmingham, and Chattanooga, different scales to the maps. But I think it's interesting to note that you have a lot of lost space in downtown Chattanooga that essentially is land banking, surface parking lots, and or aging garages that eventually should be development sites and or public space, and plenty of room to grow if you'll let the parking bubble pop. That may pop on its own with technology. Gabe Klein likes to estimate that 85% of the demand for urban parking spaces will go away with changing technology. We'll see if that turns out to be true. One last item for this is this myth of the wall of buses or the wall of transit vehicles. It's going to block the scenery of business. I think that is an understandable reflexive action response, given what Jarrett started with, which was that people are thinking about transit from outside the vehicle. But remember, transit vehicles stop for a while, they let people board in a light, you let you do your transfers, and then they move on after a while. And another one comes in behind them over time, so they're not always there. And the idea that you can't do a brisk business because the transit vehicles are blocking the view to your storefront is something that gets said that doesn't actually feel true. So I just want to state my objection to it. For example, this diner is such a popular place. If you, again, Portland here at 11th and Taylor, if you want to eat there at a brunch hour, you're going to stand in line in all likelihood, because it's such a popular place. And trust me, the fact that the transit vehicle shows up quite frequently and blocks your view of that storefront does not keep people from going in there to eat. In fact, it brings customers to it. And I think it's helpful to visualize the city as a dynamic place where just as people are moving back and forth on the sidewalks or across the crosswalks, and people on their bikes are riding by, and cars are driving by, buses and transit vehicles and light rail vehicles and the like, they enter the scene. They play their part in this ballet and motion that takes place in the city. They may briefly interrupt your direct line of sight, especially if the vehicle itself is too opaque and has too little glass. Isn't enough like those London examples I showed. And then they move on. So I hope you won't let this be the mental obstacle to taking advantage of the opportunity to put transit at the center of community life. It would be unthinkable to remove it from the places where transit is part of the story. Thanks very much. Looking forward to your questions.
All right, thanks, Victor. Now, I believe we're going to move into Q&A here. Jarrett has actually done a great job of answering some questions in chat, but we're going to highlight some of those. So if you have questions, please leave them in the chat. We'll do our best to get to them. Really great, Victor and Jarrett. I think it's, really important to talk about the human experience of being on transit. I mean, particularly the last point about the wall of buses, I think a lot of people don't think about the people that are riding, because they're riding the vehicles, they get to look out the window. Maybe they're noticing something about their community that they wouldn't have noticed if they were in a car or driving themselves. And I know I always, even though I ride transit in Indy all the time, I'm always seeing new things for the first time. When I'm on a bus, I go, oh, I never realized there was a little coffee shop there. So I think it's very important to highlight. So a few things that have been asked in the chat that I think are important to cover for all. One of the questions came up about, getting the right place. One of the questions came up about how do we measure equity and how do we build more equity into our systems? And I think Jarrett had a good answer, but if you wouldn't mind maybe elaborating on equity a little bit more.
You're still muted, Jarrett.
Sorry, the important question about equity. First of all, the short answer is when we do those freedom calculations like you saw us do, that's an easy tool to use to monitor equitable impacts. So for example, if we do a plan and we show that we've expanded freedom by this amount, we've expanded how many jobs can be reached from a certain point by this amount, we can very easily then look at how we have affected minority people as opposed to everyone, low-income people as opposed to everyone, to make sure that the effect on persons of color, the effect on low-income people, the benefit is greater than it is for the general population. And it always is. We usually are able to show really big benefits. I think the other thing that's interesting about equity is what I call the fishing pier problem of equity, which is that the people who are working on equity and social justice issues need to think carefully about what is the thing that they want to have distributed equitably. So the fishing pier problem is basically, imagine a coastal city that's planning a program of fishing piers, and the city presents a plan for a bunch of fishing piers, and they're all on the waterfront. And would a city councilor from an inland neighborhood say, hey, wait a minute, where's our fishing pier? Why are the fishing piers all on the water? And they wouldn't, because we understand that the point isn't the infrastructure. The point isn't the fishing pier. The point is the ability to fish. And the infrastructure only works in a certain place. And a lot of the equity battles I've seen around transit have made that mistake. They've been about, are we equitably distributing this thing instead of, are we equitably distributing freedom? So I think there's a lot to work on there and a lot of opportunities there. Jerome, you're muted now.
Thanks. Thanks, Jarrett. Another question is about impacts of COVID. Obviously, this is having quite an impact on transit. And so question is just what ideas are out there? What things can we do to help convince policymakers that investing in transit is a good idea as part of an economic rebound? So whoever would like to take that one.
I can help with it. Even if you aren't thinking about using transit yourself, even if in the course of the next few months you are happy to stay at home and not go anywhere and thus not have need for it, if we don't have transit functioning right now, civilization will collapse, because many of the people who are holding civilization together are relying on transit. I mean, the people who work in the hospitals, the people who work in the grocery stores, the people who are keeping the supply lines going, all of those things. So that's the short-term answer. The long-term answer is that your investment in transit and your attitude toward transit is your attitude about what you want your city to be. And as Victor has shown you, you can look around the world and see options in front of yourselves about what kind of city you want. And those options depend very heavily on what attitude you take about transit and whether you invest in it. I'll mention one other thing. Lots of people, of advocates in the United States, naturally want to compare themselves to Europe. And my line on that is, don't just envy Europe, start by envying Canada. because Canadian cities look a lot more like our cities, similar history, but there is twice as much transit service per capita. There are just more buses running around. It's not a
They're
different
also
network.
highly motorized like we are.
Yes, and they're highly motorized like we are. And if you go out into the suburban sprawl around Calgary or Edmonton or Toronto, it doesn't look that different from ours, but there are just more buses everywhere. And it makes a difference. There's more ridership. There's therefore more understanding of transit in the public discussion. More people looking at transit from the inside rather than the outside.
I think you could add Australia to that list. The Australians, like Canadians and Americans, are highly motorized as well. And Sydney is not that different from Atlanta. You know, it is different, but not that different. And yet the commitment to transit is far greater. So I would just join the chorus here and say we must invest in keeping the transit systems operating and viable through the pandemic and back to rebuilding their ridership. We ought to be creative and clever about how we reset transit and tell the story, as all of us have been talking about, so that when we can all come back and do the things we want to do, like enjoy meals in restaurants together and attend concerts together and all of those things, we are also back on transit. And if we let the transit agencies languish and fall into disrepair during this challenging period, we made a terrible and expensive mistake. It costs us so much more to clamber out of. So right now, a deep commitment locally and nationally should be made to keeping those transit systems going through the emergency. It is that. It's an emergency, and we're going to get past it. There will be another one after that in some form. We know that there will always be one thing or another changing the world and in our news. But this one, transit is not. It's not an option to let transit go away.
Great answers, and I'll just tag on really quick. You know, one of our challenges, especially nationally, is the way transit is funded. There's a lot of dollars that are put towards capital, building new shiny things, whether it be BRT, light rail, or new, metro line, ribbon cuttings, which, are going to be necessary in some cases. But a lot of that funding can't go to operating, just the basics of operating more service. And that's really where we can make the biggest difference. It's operating, especially with the Humble bus, operating more frequent service in more places. That really is going to make a big difference for little capital investment. So that's just another important thing.
Hey, Jerome, Jarrett said something pretty profound a little while ago, but in his modest way, just kind of glazed over really fast. And I'm going to make him re-say it. The Pulse system or plan for operations and routing that you devised and showed is intended to be implemented with the same funding that Chattanooga already devotes to its current system. Did I get that right?
Exactly.
So that's a really big deal. We're not talking about doubling or tripling it or quadrupling it yet.
Yeah, we showed you the short-term plan, which can be funded with CARTA's ridiculously meager starvation resources. We also developed a long-range plan that can show what you might be able to have in Chattanooga if you had more of a Canadian scale transit system with a lot more bus service. And that shows a much broader network of high frequency service. It's actually very similar to the map of Indianapolis that Jerome showed, which is also a longer range plan. And the interesting thing is, in the longer run, as the service gets more frequent, we need the Pulse less, because once the bus coming every 15 minutes, the connection is no longer a problem. But it's a dire problem as long as your transit system is so impoverished that you have to run some routes every 30 or 60 minutes. So I think that's important for thinking about the transit center site. It's something that probably needs to be able to continue to evolve as the network grows.
Great. So, one of the things we've been talking about is there's a lot of separate elements, whether there's transit infrastructure, there's land use zoning, there's the implications of all that. A lot of this is all holistic. Like we've been having a lot of conversations in silos about what we're going to build or what we're going to do. But, transit is successful for a variety of reasons, and land use and zoning is a big part of that. So can we dive a little bit more into, the importance of, how, getting more dense development near transit is important, but also maybe for more outlying areas that are suburban today, how do we tackle those challenges? Because one of the things I believe, Jarrett, I think you answered it in the chat, and one of the questions was about, increased suburbanization of poverty and that phenomena, and how that's a challenge for transit systems. So could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
My advice to low-income people who are looking for an affordable place to live is don't assume that because the rent is cheapest, that will be where life is cheapest. Chattanooga has these low-income apartments built on cul-de-sacs next to the freeway in places, if you look at them and think, what would the bus do to even get close to this? It becomes clear that it's been designed in a way such that efficient public transit is impossible, geometrically impossible. Now, so what we can do in the suburbs is, run down the major arterials where we can at least run, although there are other issues there, like it's often too dangerous to cross the street. But the other conversation we usually have is, well, can we do demand responsive things? Can we subsidize Uber or whatever? We can, but that's fantastically expensive per rider compared to fixed routes going down main streets. So you have to understand, transit is going to discriminate against people in extremely transit inaccessible places. And that will sound like we're discriminating against you as people. We're not. We're responding to the geometry of the development and what that says about whether we can be useful there. Very difficult issue. If you're thinking of, if as a low-income person, you're thinking about where to locate, think about the total cost of life and not just the cost of housing.
So, Jerome, I think this is related to Sarah's question in the chat as well, because she's asking about when you do try to build your way out of your problems by clustering or consolidating denser, more intense development, or just bringing more souls close together in a space to improve the viability of transit at that location. That's a reasonable strategy for retrofitting suburbia, especially on places that are along the routes that Jarrett has described. But when you do that, you're likely to get pushback because people are going to say that new denser development is going to generate huge congestion, traffic congestion problems. And I think we need to address why that is. The folks in the region are conditioned to expect that when they get this much development, just this much development, they're going to get that much traffic congestion. And the reason is because the places that have typically been developed have been developed disconnected, not mixed use, and relatively low density and very car dependent. So if you can turn all those around and build places that are mixed use, are reasonably dense enough to support many car trip eliminations, not just conversions to a transit trip. You could, for example, accomplish something in your neighborhood without having to go out on the regional road network in a car to do it. You'll start to break that down. And that means designing the street system so that it interconnects, not the geometry problem that Jarrett described, but less like a tree and more like a web. I think that's that will assist in that. And smaller blocks make it more feasible to walk and bike, which in turn make it more feasible to serve transit. And then, it's more compact, bringing people within distance, not just of the bus stop, but also of the corner store or cafe that they might patronize without having to drive there to do it, and maybe their congregation or what have you. So or their friends that they could visit, and freedom that they could offer their kids. So there are a lot of benefits there. So don't assume that the old everybody's going to drive everywhere for every time paradigm has to be true in the new development where you're building your way out of your problems. It doesn't. But that means you have to get the rules right. And I think Chattanooga deserves a lot of credit for working hard in recent years with form-based code for downtown, for example, to try and fix the rule book that caused development to take the wrong form when it was built.
Thanks, Victor. One of the hot topics is fare-free transit or free transit. So I'll start this off and then I'll transition, but a free bus that comes once an hour is still a bus that comes once an hour. And the question is, how useful is that to somebody? What's more important? So I'll start with that, and then if Victor or Jarrett want to kind of dive more into free transit. Any thoughts on that?
It's much easier to talk about the fare of transit than to talk about transit service. You can talk about it in fewer words in a way that everyone understands, whereas transit service, as we've seen, you have to think about it a little bit, you have to explain it. And, there's that old saying that when you're explaining, you're losing. So it's understandable that the focus has gone to the fair, that the focus of equity conversation has gone to the fair, but I agree with Jerome completely. Free, lousy transit is just not of much use to anyone. It's not equitable. It's not liberating. And I think this conversation about free transit has to happen in the context of understanding how dreadfully impoverished American transit agencies are and how desperately they need resources just to run more service. And if all those resources go into making transit free, we're going to have, transit that never gets any better because there isn't the money to do that.
So there's a lot to watch here because last time I checked, there were about 100 major, significant cases of fare-free transit around the country and abroad that are all worth watching. And Kansas City was one of them, the big, more recent headlines last December when they went to fare-free. So if a local government says, we're going to replace that revenue that was coming in from the fares and with an expanded commitment to improving the lousy service to make it better, you might actually see the progress that people want. I know one interesting case that got a lot of attention a long time ago now was when Giuliani was mayor of New York and he made the Staten Island ferry free. Remember that, Jarrett? They calculated that it was actually costing them more money to collect the money than it was than they were getting. Right. And of course, ridership went up, which is not surprising. So when you want more of something, you subsidize it, incentivize it, or make it free. And when you want less of something, you penalize it and charge more for it. So I think that there's room in here for creativity, but let's not use it as an excuse to starve the transit system's budget even more than it's already starved.
Great answer. One question that came up a little bit earlier was about dedicating space and who we allocate space for, particularly on the streets. There was one specific question about in Indianapolis. I showed a photo of our dedicated bus lanes on a major thoroughfare and what were some of the challenges into convincing local politicians to get that dedicated space. And yeah, it was certainly a battle. Our original plans for our BRT line actually said that there shouldn't be any dedicated lanes. And we really worked hard with both the public and elected officials to really talk about, how we're moving people through a corridor and not just objects. And by objects, I mean cars. I don't think any of us had this in our presentations, but there's a lot of great images that show here's 40 people, standing, here's 40 people on bikes, here's 40 people on one bus, here's 40 people in their single occupancy vehicles and how much space that takes up. And I mean, that's really what we're getting at. And Jarrett talks about this all the time, right? Technology does not change geometry, right? It's still going to take up space. Even if we have autonomous vehicles and they're all driving themselves and close together, those vehicles have to occupy a certain amount of area. Versus if you can get everyone onto either smaller vehicles that are more efficient or a bus, that's really what it comes down to. And so we had to spend a lot of time talking with our officials about, what are our priorities as a community? And it's going to be different and contextually different in every city about what the priorities are and what the values are. But if we are talking about dense urban centers, the best way to move people is going to be on large vehicles like transit or small vehicles like scooters and bikes. And in the case of BRT, to guarantee that it's going to be reliable, dedicated space to those vehicles is really important. And I think that comes to, there was another question I saw about some of the trade-offs between coverage and frequency. So Jarrett, would you care to elaborate on that a little bit more?
Sure. Frequency is expensive. Frequency also pays off exponentially. It pays off exponentially in ridership, and the reason for that is that it pays off exponentially in freedom. It is a very efficient way to expand freedom because waiting time is such a large part of travel time in infrequent transit systems. And by the way, when we calculate freedom, when we calculate how far you can get to in amount of time, we are always counting half of the frequency. We're always counting that weight against the travel time. And the weighting is often the dominant part of it. The challenge is that frequency is very expensive. And so an impoverished network that's trying to deploy frequency is going to go fewer places because it has to concentrate its resource where the demand is greatest. That's going to mean it doesn't go to parts of its service area and those people yell at it and say, we pay taxes too, where's ours? Or, you know, we have a low-income community that's been built out here on a cul-de-sac in the wilderness, where is its service? And if you look at Chattanooga's transit network, you'll see the result of that. You'll see a network that has been spread across the entire city, including in places that are quite transit hostile. On the west side of the airport, there's a very large low-income housing destination that is way up on a cul-de-sac up off the road. And the bus has to turn and drive all the way up that cul-de-sac and turn down and drive all the way back. There's no way to provide useful service out there. There's a way to provide lifeline service for the most desperate. But that's not the way you build ridership, and it's not the way you expand freedom for the most city. So every study we do, I have to take the board, and we do this all over the country and overseas. I have to take the board through this trade-off and understand if you want high ridership, you're going to concentrate high frequency where demand is, where the geography is most favorable. You have the most people around each stop able to use it. But that's going to mean not going to lots of places. So there's a trade-off between frequency and coverage, and we ask every transit agency board to decide how they want to divide their resources between those goals. It's the hardest question and the most unavoidable question.
Actually, I've witnessed this because Jarrett and his colleague Scudderwag have been doing exactly this for Miami and what we locally are calling the Better Bus Project. And it's stimulated an amazing community conversation about just exactly this. It looks like they're trying to meld the two into a compromise scenario, a little bit of each, as opposed to the exaggerated versions of one or the other. But that discussion was really productive for our community, and I think I would recommend every community that can should do the same thing.
Thank you.
Building off this discussion about trade-offs, one of the questions, or one of the more recent questions, is about better bus stops and integrating better, more high-quality bus stops into city code in Chattanooga. So I'll just speak from a high-level perspective really quick, is that one of those trade-offs, if you are able to provide more frequent service, you might not have as much coverage. But with transit agencies, the actual individual bus stops themselves are also a topic of discussion of, one, how close are those bus stops spaced out? And then what is at those bus stops can also make a big difference. One thing that we learned in Indy is that part of our frequent bus network design requires us spacing out the routes a little bit further, which means that people may, and the stops. So that means people may have to walk a block or two further to bus service, but they're walking to service that is better, that's running more often, and it's running every day of the week. And some of the feedback we heard, especially from maybe some of our older population with mobility issues, is like that they said, I'm okay with walking another block or two, but when I get to that stop, I would love to have a place to sit down. That makes a really big difference. So the quality of the waiting experience, if people need to wait, is important too. And having amenities such as a place to sit at bus stops can really make a difference. So specifically to Chattanooga, are there, how can Chattanooga better integrate bus stops into city code and site development?
Victor?
A favorite topic. Well, first of all, you have in recent years added all sorts of information and expectations in the Land Development Code. For example, in the form-based code for downtown and its environs that weren't there before. And as you did so, Chattanooga also simplified certain things. They introduced new flexibility in other areas so that it wasn't all just new requirements. Some of it was new flexibility. But it's perfectly normal to actually take the next step and upgrade your standards for the public realm. And that can include the bus stops and bus shelters so that it becomes normal to provide shelter, for example, as opposed to just a advertisement for some ambulance chasing lawyer on the back of a bench and off to the side. So that's the perfectly normal thing to go to next. But when you do, you can also upgrade your public realm standards with things like street trees, because it occurs to me that when we install transit, we think, okay, well, I need the bench, or we need the shelter we've been talking about, or if we're installing a fancier system, maybe the platforms and fare boxes, or escalators, or what have you. Ramps, maybe if it's a level boarding BRT and that kind of thing. Well, those all sound like mission critical equipment, just like the bus itself or the streetcar or what have you. But I think that the sidewalk leading to that stop or that station with a tree canopy is just as mission critical. A few years ago, I was asked by the mayor in our county, what would you do to improve ridership? And I said, I would put the person in charge of growing transit ridership in charge of street design, because they would realize that unless they designed and imposed tree-lined streets and doors and windows facing the street and all those things that come with, and good slow speed intersection designs that are crossable with high visibility crosswalks and those kinds of things. You can't boost ridership just by adding more buses alone. You need to get people to them and recognize their dignity as pedestrians after they get off the vehicle. So it's a natural thing to do. Public Works Manual might be the place, or public realm standards in the form-based code could be a place. What matters is that you reset the expectation.
Excellent, Victor. Yeah, that we're really at the heart of what we're talking about is thinking about places differently and designing places for people first, and then we add in the other stuff later. We're getting close to time here, so if there aren't any more questions, I just want to ask if Jarrett or Victor, if you have some final thoughts that we want to drive home for the conversation today. This has been an excellent conversation, and really thankful to our hosts for allowing this event to happen. But Jarrett or Victor, do you have any final words? And then I guess we'll turn it back over to Eric or whomever is still on the line.
Well, I'll just say that I love Chattanooga, and although you have a lot of work to do to heal some of the damage and to redirect your city, you also have wonderful, wonderful resources in your natural environment, and that I think many cities would envy. So I wish you well, and I think you have a lot to build on.
I visit Chattanooga very often, and then I take the stories I learn and share them other places. And I can tell you that around the country, a lot of other cities look to Chattanooga for leadership. And they know the story of how in the 1970s, Chattanooga was reviled in the national press as the dirtiest little city in America. And, in a lot of other cities where we work, the mayor and the city manager or the Chamber of Commerce would have immediately held a press conference and denied it. Somebody else is the dirtiest little city in America. And that's not what Chattanooga did. They cleaned up the river. They cleaned up the riverfront. They revitalized downtown. They pioneered with the electric shuttle. They went green on purpose and aimed very high. So my final thought is, don't stop doing that. You need to continue aiming high in the same way that you did then through the 70s, 80s, and 90s in the current era, because the whole country is watching what Chattanooga does. They know that old story, and they want to see what the next chapter is.
That's so wonderful. What a great conversation. Jerome, Jarrett, Victor, it was a pleasure to be with you guys this afternoon, this morning. I really appreciate it. I think you're right on. I think the city as a dynamic place. Chattanooga is a dynamic city. We're changing. We continue to change, and I really appreciate everything that you've said and all that you brought to the conversation today. Appreciate being here with you guys, and I appreciate everybody that attended today. Thanks for your time. Hope to see you guys soon.
Thanks, everyone.